I'd like to speak with you not about NSA or any of the vast federal spying apparatus that so eroded our personal and financial liberty, nor about the TSA that wants to, undermine our personal physical bodies at the airport, nor about the countless drug laws or smoking laws or helmet laws or ID laws or big gulp laws or any of the myriad of laws and rules and regulations that come together to create and make up our current soft police state, or nanny state if you prefer. Now, I say soft police state because while we know that the United States is heading down a very dangerous path, we should respect those who suffered in the very real, not soft police states of the 20th century. And I would say that as of today anyway, there's no comparison. So we shouldn't use the term lightly. But if we don't see the growing parallels between totalitarian societies in history and modern-day America, I would argue that we only have ourselves to blame. But what I would like to discuss today is really the business end of the police state, which is to say the police themselves. Now, not federal agents necessarily, but just your garden variety local cops and sheriffs, your police officer. For many people, police represent their only real tangible contact with the state. Sure, they pay their taxes and they comply with a million petty government rules and regulations, but in their day-to-day lives, walking around, at home, at work, driving in their cars, they don't necessarily see or feel the heavy hand of government. So for the average law-abiding American who's not likely to come in contact with, let's say, the president or their local congressperson or even their local mayor, police serve as the most visible reminder of the state and its presence. And hopefully most of us don't interact with police much at all. Maybe the occasional speeding ticket or fender bender. But for those Americans who do find themselves interacting with police today, the actions, attitudes, and mindset of those police officers is likely to be very different and have changed very dramatically from, say, 30 years ago. And I would say it's probably likely to have changed dramatically for the worse. Perhaps as recently as 30 years ago, we still maintained at least a peace officer archetype in our national consciousness. So the question is, whatever happened to peace officers? Well, today when we use the term peace officer, it sounds antiquated and outdated. We might as well say floppy disk or buggy whips, I suppose. And I'm sure that some of the younger people here today have never really heard the term used in conversation. But in the 1800s, part of the 1800s, and really through the 1960s in this country, the term was widely used in America to apply generically to lawmen, sheriffs, constables, troopers, marshals, and the like. But today, the old moniker of peace officer has been almost totally eliminated in popular usage, and it's been replaced at first by police officer, and now the more in vogue law enforcement officer. Now, the terminology has certain legal differences in some settings, and in some places, peace officers and police officers are actually different people with different functions, different jurisdictions, different powers to execute warrants. But nobody says peace officer anymore, and it's not just a coincidence. The evolution of language, particularly when it's driven by our legal and political and media class, can have powerful implications for all of us. And I submit that the morphing of peace officers into police officers is more than just linguistic. Now, the archetype of a peace officer is mostly fictitious, of course. Sheriffs in old westerns come to mind. Stern lawmakers, they used to carry colts called peacemakers. But the problem is the Wyatt Earps of Western myth weren't always so peaceful. And of course, at least in movies, and they often use those peacemakers to shoot up the place. So, and while most Americans today can't really relate to the Old West, we do have enough institutional memory. By that, that's a polite way of saying older folks. To paint a pretty accurate picture of the trusted police officer of Norman Rockwell's America in the first half of the 20th century. So fictitious or not, whole generations of Americans grew up with an apple pie view of the peace officer as a friend, not as an agent of the state to be feared. Of course, Sheriff Andy Taylor of the Andy Griffith Show is perhaps the best and most facile example of what it once meant, at least in the American psyche, to be a peace officer. And it's really neat. If you ever have some spare time, you can go on YouTube and find an unbelievable amount of old Andy Griffith shows. But as a peace officer, Sheriff Taylor exhibits what I would say are 4 key traits that profoundly distinguish him from most modern police officers. First, Sheriff Taylor is part of his community. He does not see himself, nor do others see him, as somehow apart and separate from the residents of Mayberry. He does not exhibit an us versus them mentality that seems so prevalent in many police officers today. He does not see himself first and foremost as a government employee or a union member. He does not resent the people he protects, but instead considers himself a fellow citizen. In other words, Andy Taylor is a true civilian police officer. Second, he truly seeks to maintain peace within Mayberry and sees his job as keeping the town safe, happy, quiet, peaceful. He's a peacekeeper, not an enforcer. In fact, he seldom uses force. He does not want a crime wave to hit Mayberry to justify an increase in his salary or budget or staff. On the contrary, he would view an increase in local crime as a personal failure. He's apt to downplay rather than exaggerate the importance of his job. His focus is on creating an environment that discourages crime in the first place. Third, in every instance, Sheriff Taylor attempts to smooth over and diffuse problems rather than escalate them. He invariably looks for simple, common sense, polite answers to conflicts rather than using his legal authority to threaten or arrest. He rarely concerns himself with technical application of the law, but rather uses his judgment to solve problems and make them go away with the least fuss possible. He never makes a bad situation worse. For example, in one memorable scene, Andy and his feckless deputy, Barney Fife, have been summoned to the dilapidated home of an angry man who's causing a disturbance. And upon seeing the 2 officers arrive with their car, the man promptly begins firing at them with his rifle from a second-story window. Now, Barney reacts as you might expect. He pulls out his own rifle and calls in reinforcements and sort of barricades himself behind the door of the squad car, preparing for a big shootout. But Andy, by contrast, sort of knows the man to be somewhat cranky and thinks he can talk him out of it. So he crouches over and zigzags and makes his way up to the door of the house and somehow enters the house. And then he emerges in short order with the suspect, who's now much calmer. And Andy has, as usual, talked him out of it. And no arrest is made, if you can imagine that. Fourth and finally, Andy genuinely cares about and tries to help the people of Mayberry, having their best interests at heart. See, for example, his gentle treatment of Otis, the town drunk. And as a result, he has the trust, admiration, and respect of the townspeople. Now, of course, as I mentioned, Andy Griffith's show was fictional, and there's no doubt that many, many small-town sheriffs in America over the decades have probably been anything but peaceful. Yet it's fascinating that just a few decades ago, Americans could identify with the character of Sheriff Taylor as a recognizable ideal. So, we fast forward to 2014, and clearly Norman Rockwell's America is mostly gone. Obviously, the situation today is very different, and we all know that police have suffered a very serious decline over the last several decades, both in terms of their public image and the degree to which average citizens now often fear police officers rather than trust them. Allow me to mention a few particularly egregious recent examples of police escalating and harming rather than protecting and serving. The first case you might have heard about is very recent. It's heartbreaking. A 90-pound mentally ill young man was very recently killed by 3 so-called law enforcement officers from 3 different agencies in the town of Southport, North Carolina. He was apparently having a schizophrenic episode and brandishing a screwdriver when police arrived in answer to his own family's 911 call for help. Well, some help. The first 2 officers managed to calm him down a bit, but the third officer arriving later escalated the situation, demanding that the other 2 officers use their tasers on this poor young man. And once his body hit the ground, this young person was brutally shot at close range and killed by the third officer for reasons that remain unclear. So here we really see modern police at work. Escalation, aggression, a lack of common sense making a bad situation worse, overriding concern for the safety of police officers, regardless of the consequences for those being protected. These are not the hallmarks of peace officers, to put it mildly. A second case you might have heard about happened in Fullerton, California in 2011, and Will Grigg has written extensively about this horrific and brutal police crime, where a homeless man was sadistically beaten and suffocated by about 5 or 6 different officers after a routine loitering stop. Now, he was fairly slender of build, and he did have a history of mental health issues, but the toxicology report done after his death found no trace of drugs or alcohol. And it really seems just an instance of 6 officers wildly overreacting to a homeless man who was perhaps loitering outside of a private business. Now, this attack took place over almost 10 minutes, and ultimately the man died. Well, ultimately the man suffered numerous broken bones in addition to the constriction of his airway by the force of 6 men laying and sitting on him during this beating. A beating during which, I might add, he begged and pleaded for his life, but to no avail. And once he was adequately subdued, the police made sure to take their good time in summoning an ambulance for him. And when the ambulance did come, they made sure that it attended to the very minor injuries of the police officers first. Of course, the officers claimed that they were merely using justifiable force, and criminal charges for second-degree murder and manslaughter against 2 of the officers involved recently resulted in an acquittal. And as a result of that acquittal, the district attorney dropped the charges against the 3rd officer. Now, depending on one's point of view, these officers may be seen as nothing more than vicious gang members guilty of murder. Or for a virulent law and order type, they may be seen in an exceedingly charitable light, simply as overzealous cops involved in an unfortunate situation that got out of hand. But in no universe can they be seen as peace officers.